Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. Welcome to our virtual Wayland Library event. I hope you can all hear me. Tonight, we are thrilled to have Kate Clifford Larson here with us to talk about her new book, Walk With Me, A Biography of Fannie Lou Hamer. Dr. Larson is a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestselling author of 3 critically acclaimed biographies: Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, Portrait of an American Hero; Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy Daughter; and The Assassin's Accomplice, Mary Surratt and the Plot to Kill Abraham Lincoln. She's consulted on documentaries, museum exhibits, public history initiatives, tours, and numerous publications, as well as feature film scripts, including Harriet, starring Cynthia Erivo, and Robert Redford's The Conspirator. Her award-winning consulting work includes Maryland's Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad State and National Historic Park and the Harriet Tubman Home in Auburn, New York. Just one more person in here. There we go. Dr. Larson earned her doctorate in American history at UNH, specializing in 19th and 20th century American women's and African American history. Thank you so much to Dr. Larson for being here with us tonight. I just have a couple housekeeping notes. First, as you probably heard when you signed on, we are recording for Waycam, our local cable access station, and also for the library's YouTube page. I am recording myself, Dr. Larson, and her slides, so your face won't be on there. If you speak up, eventually it will. And Dr. Larson will be giving about a 40-minute talk, and then we'll have some time for questions. Feel free to put your questions into the chat at any point, and we'll save them till the end. I'll read them aloud. Or when we get to that point, you are welcome, of course, to unmute and ask your question. So now that I've got that out of the way, I will hand it over to Dr. Larson.
Thank you very, very much. Well, it's great to be here. And I get to talk about one of my favorite people, Fannie Lou Hamer. So I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides that I'd like to use to show what I'm talking about. And so just hang with me for a minute here. And there we go. So Fannie Lou Hamer. Hamer was, this isn't moving, there we go. Hamer was born in October of 1917. Actually, her birthday was yesterday, October 6th. And she was born in Mississippi, and she lived in the Mississippi Delta, the cotton kingdom of the country. And she was the 20th child of sharecroppers Jim and Ella Townsend. And the life for African-American sharecroppers in Mississippi was a life of incredibly hard work and poverty and, just a very, very difficult existence. And in fact, when she was born as the 20th child, the family had already lost 7 children. 7 children had died, including 4 babies in the 4 years before Hamer was born. The survival rate for African-American children was much lower than it was for white children in Mississippi at the time. They moved from Choctaw County, where she was born, when she was about 3 or 4 years old, to Sunflower County and the town of Ruleville, and they moved to a plantation near that to be sharecroppers on that particular plantation. School for African-American children in Mississippi was segregated. There were separate schools for Black and white. Most of the educational funding in the state went to the white schools. Very little money went to Black schools, and Black schools were only open 3 or 4 months out of the year. So the education was very limited and the options very small. And in Sunflower County, there was no high school for African-American children. Some communities only had it till 6th grade, others had it till 8th grade, but it was very limited. And of course, in Mississippi, African Americans had limited rights as citizens. They were not basically allowed to vote. Very few of the African Americans could register. Half the population was Black, and only about 5% of eligible Black voters were able to register to vote. And there were poll taxes and things like that that people had to pay. In Mississippi, in the Delta, of course, cotton was the king, and that drove the cycles of life on in the Delta, Mississippi Delta. And when Hamer was 6 years old, she started picking cotton with her family, and the few pennies that she could earn actually did make a little bit of a difference for the family. Winters were very difficult for sharecroppers when they had no income, and they had to store food and find ways to make it through cold winters, and so they could survive into the spring when the season would start over again. Mississippi is one of the most violent states in the nation, and it has the terrible reputation of having the most lynchings in the country as well. And so violence against African Americans was common, and it was used to subjugate them, keep them in line, and keep them from standing up and claiming their rights. As Hamer aged throughout the 1920s, her family struggled. Some of her siblings aged and moved on, got married and moved to other farms, had their own families. So, and her parents got older and older and more disabled, and the responsibility of providing for her family fell to young Fannie Lou Hamer. When she was in the 6th grade, she had to drop out of school as soon as the Great Depression started to help her family pick cotton and to survive. But she grew up in this environment that was not only filled with violence and subjugation and discrimination, but there were incredible other things about the area. The Mississippi Delta blues is a famous music genre, and the birth site of it is about 6 miles from where Fannie Lou Hamer grew up. So she had an incredible singing voice from the time she was a child. She was raised in the Black Baptist Church there in Ruleville, Mississippi. Her father was a part-time Baptist minister. So music, spirituals were a big part of her life in church and in her home and out in the fields. But also in Mississippi's fields, the field workers would sing their work songs and their call and response songs that are so typical of African American workers. And that was blended and fused with the Mississippi Delta blues, and which came out of those fields and came out of that experience. And when I did research and I contacted blues historians, one of them, Mary Williams, said to me that Hamer sort of exemplifies that Mississippi Delta blues, that she had a blues riddled life. And you can hear it in her singing. I encourage you to go onto YouTube and you can hear some of her songs when she's on stage and she's performing at civil rights rallies and the Newport Blues Festival in the 1960s. So you can hear not only the church music, but also that blues in the folk songs that she sang as well. In about 1930, her mother injured her eye, one of her eyes, chopping some brush in the field, and something flew up in her eye and it became infected and she ended up going blind. So the depression, which came then and it hit Mississippi very, very hard, was doubly difficult because of disabled Ella, who was a fierce and protective mother. In fact, she used to carry a gun into the field, a handgun, and she put it in a bucket and carried it to the field to protect her daughters and other young women in the field from white men who would come and try to take them and attack them in the fields. So in 1939, her father died of a stroke, and that left Hamer alone. She was 22 years old with her mother. The family had started distilling liquor. Mississippi was a dry state. It had become a dry state many years before Prohibition, but it was legal to make bootleg liquor in your home and for your own use. And of course, that kind of slid into people making it and selling it to make ends meet. So Hamer learned this from her father, and she carried on doing that to help her mother and herself survive. She married a man by the name of Pap Hamer in 1944. She had married another man but divorced him. The marriage didn't work out in the early 1940s. And Pap Hamer was a local sharecropper and a mechanic. He was a valuable worker on the Marlowe plantation outside of Ruleville. And they fell in love and got married. He also ran a juke joint in his sharecropper cabin, serving barbecue and selling liquor that he made in the home. He and Fannie Lou wanted to have children of their own, but she suffered several miscarriages and reportedly two stillbirths. They adopted two girls, Dorothy Jean and Virgie, and they worked the fields on the Marlowe plantation, and Pap also was the mechanic for the equipment that was becoming more popular in the fields. There was, trucks instead of mules, and there were, all sorts of agricultural equipment that the larger plantation owners were starting to buy to replace the labor of their sharecroppers and their day laborers. And Pap knew how to fix that equipment, so he had a fairly secure position on the plantation. During the 1950s, the civil rights movement took off. I mean, it had been percolating for generations, but in the 1950s here in America, the civil rights movement took on a new urgency, and it was empowered by the Brown versus Board of Education to desegregate schools, which was passed by the Supreme Court in 1954. And then the reaction, particularly in the South, was violence against African Americans who wanted to have equal rights. They wanted desegregation. The murder of Emmett Till, whose anniversary was just a few weeks ago, a 14-year-old boy that was murdered by white people in Mississippi, several white men. He was murdered 6 miles from where Fannie Lou Hamer lived and worked in Ruleville. That murder shocked the nation. And then a few months after Emmett Till's murder in August of 1955, Rosa Parks decided to not get up from her seat, even though that was a planned event, on a bus in Montgomery, and that sparked the Montgomery bus boycott for a year. Now, Hamer, during the 1960s, when she was famous and she was speaking around the country, she used to say she didn't know anything about civil rights, that she didn't know anything about voting and all of that. Why she told audiences that, I'm not really sure, because in fact, she was active in the civil rights movement in the 1950s. She belonged to local civil rights organizations, and she attended these mass meetings called Mound Bayou Days in May, where people from around the state would come and they would hear speakers like Thurgood Marshall and other famous people, and she would attend private meetings about how to encourage people to stand up, register with the NAACP, and also to try to campaign for votes for equality for Mississippians. So she was active, and she was not naive like she later claimed to be. I'm just gonna, hold on one second. There we go. And as the 1950s went on, of course, we had the Little Rock desegregation order in 1957. The National Guard was sent in by President Eisenhower to protect the young students who were going to integrate the high school there. And then in 1960, there were the lunch counter sit-ins. Young people around the country decided to step up and force the issue. Particularly in the South, there were segregated seating in restaurants and restrooms, water fountains. Many of you have seen those photographs of the separate water fountains and separate entrances to businesses for Blacks and whites. So, but young people decided to force integration, like sitting at the lunch counter in Woolworth's restaurants in the South. So this is, things are getting more intense, and the violent backlash is quite intense as well. As you can see, these white people pouring stuff over the, hot coffee and ketchup and mustard over these students who were trying to integrate these restaurants. And the freedom rides, the bus rides, the government had passed rules. The Federal Interstate Commission had ruled that buses that traveled from state to state, interstate, could not segregate passengers, and the terminals at bus stations had to serve Black passengers in the same restaurant, in the same place that they served white passengers. And Southerners in southern cities, in buses and on terminals fought back And when these freedom riders on these buses that purposely traveled through these southern states and stopped at these bus terminals, they were attacked by white vigilantes and beaten and attacked and shot at. It was quite a dramatic response. And this particular bus was firebombed. I think that one was in Alabama. So there was something that happened to Hamer that sort of transformed her from a local kind of quiet activist to make the decision to move on to the national stage. In 1961, she had been suffering from fibroid tumors in her uterus, and they were causing quite a bit of discomfort and clearly part of the reason that she could not successfully get pregnant and carry a child to term. She was recommended to go to a local white doctor, Dr. Charles Doro, who was the son of the mayor of Ruleville, Charles Doro Sr. And she went to him and he said he would take care of the fibroid tumors for her. Well, while she was sedated, he gave her a complete hysterectomy and sterilized her. And this was not a one-off thing. Actually, he did many of these in that county, in that region, and it was known as a Mississippi appendectomy. Sometimes women would go in for an appendectomy, or with an appendix attack, and they would come out without their uterus. So it was a thing throughout the South, and it happened to poor women, not just Black women. Black women suffered disproportionately, but it happened throughout the South and in Appalachia and places like that. It was not ruled illegal until 1973, which is really shocking to me. But once Hamer discovered that she had been sterilized, it sent her into a spiraling depression that she struggled to get out of. And of course, she immediately went into immediate menopause as well. So she's dealing with these dramatic menopause symptoms and this depression that her hopes of having her own family with Pap had been destroyed by this white man, and she had no recourse. It wasn't like she could stand up to a white man there in Ruleville, Mississippi. It just wasn't going to happen. So through her deep faith and the support of her husband and family and community, she came out of that depression. And the way I describe it in my book is that she was reborn, and she was determined that she needed to make a difference in the world. Now, she had always complained to her fellow sharecroppers that it was unfair how they were treated in those fields. They were cheated out of the wages that they earned. The white bosses sometimes inaccurately weighed the cotton that they picked and told them they didn't pick as much as they knew they had picked so that they would earn less money. So she was looking for ways to make a difference and to change that dynamic. So in a group of young activists who belonged to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee came to Ruleville in August of 1962. The SNCC, as it is referred to, had been started in 1960 under the guidance of Ella Baker, who worked with Martin Luther King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. And she noticed that young people had this energy. She watched them in the lunch counter sit-ins, and she watched them on the freedom rides, and she knew that they had to tap into the potential of young people around the country who wanted to make a difference. Robert Paris Moses, known as Bob Moses, he recently died, an incredible civil rights activist. He was one of the first SNCC workers, and he moved to Atlanta. He was a Harvard grad. He taught high school in New York. And he came down to Atlanta to be part of SNCC and the movement. And she sent him to Mississippi in 1961 and said, this is one of the worst states. See what you can do about getting to know the local people, and let's talk about voter registration with them. So he was part of the group that came to Hamer's town in 1962, and they met at her church. And about 200 Black residents showed up, which was incredibly brave of them because they knew to expect violence if they were known to have attended this meeting of civil rights activists. And they spoke in a language that Hamer was attracted to. One of the SNCC workers, James Bevel, was a minister. He used Bible passages to say, this is your right. You deserve to be able to be equal, and you should be able to vote. And so she was inspired. And he really convinced them, along with Bob Moses. And so when they asked for people to raise their hands if they were willing to go to the county courthouse in Indianola in Sunflower County the following week to try to register to vote, to try to pass that onerous voting rights test, the literacy test, she raised her hand. She was ready to do it. And when they went there the next week, she was the first person off the bus. She marched up the steps of the courthouse and went in to register the vote. She failed the literacy test. And of course, she was literate, unlike some of her neighbors who were not literate at all, but she failed the literacy test. I have a picture here of a man, he's a circuit clerk court clerk in a neighboring county, Forest County, and he was notorious. His name was Theron Lind, and he refused to register African-American citizens in that county. And he defied court order after court order after court order for years and years that were forcing him to register Black voters, and he wouldn't. Well, it was similar to that almost in every county in Mississippi. But eventually, Hamer stuck with it. But the night after she registered and she failed the test, she went home, and her landlord met her at her cabin where she lived with her 2 daughters and Pap. And he wanted to know what she had done. And she told him that she had gone down to register to vote. And he said, "We're not ready for that in Mississippi." And he evicted her that night. So she struggled, Pap, and she struggled very much. There was violence that was perpetrated. People tried to hurt her, and white vigilantes drove through the town of Ruleville, where many of the residents who had attended that meeting, they drove through and shot through houses, and they injured people, trying to threaten them and discourage them from trying to register to vote. But Fannie Lou Hamer was determined that she was going to make a difference and that they were not going to stop her. And she often said, they've been trying to kill me my whole life. And if they kill me now, at least I'm trying to make a difference. So the SNCC workers noticed Hamer's leadership in the community. People looked up to her. She was a leader already. She was a natural born leader. They didn't come into Mississippi to become leaders themselves. They wanted to find and support local leaders. And Fannie Lou Hamer was one of them that they found. And so they hired her as a field worker to help people learn how to register to vote and to encourage them to stand up and try to make a difference in Mississippi. And so there were stages and, in churches and in rallies, and she noticed that most of the movement in Mississippi was controlled by middle-class, better educated men, Black men and some white men who were brave enough to be part of it. And she was often asked to come up on the stage and sing to get the crowd all excited and wound up. But she had a voice not only for singing, but she had a message, and she wanted to deliver that message. So she watched and she learned, and she figured out how she was going to get on that stage and deliver her message, because she was an amazing speaker, not only a beautiful singer, but she was an amazing speaker. And she spoke, she preached. She learned the skills, those rhetorical skills, from her father, the Baptist minister, and she'd get on the stage and she would arouse a crowd like none of the other men could. She was really incredible. As a matter of fact, one civil rights veteran, Dr. Leslie Burr McLemore, who lived in Mississippi, he was a young man at the time when he met her, and she was in her mid-40s. He recalled, quote, that Hamer was, quote, the star, the person that all of them were wowed by. No one equaled her storytelling, he said. And he later also said that she was a powerhouse. And another civil rights worker, Dorothy Cotton, said that Hamer would get on the stage and she would shine her light, and people caught her spirit. She was really amazing, really amazing. So SNCC, they were paying her not very much money, a little bit every week. And also they would send her to training programs and classes with other young people and older people in Mississippi to learn how to teach civics and also in citizenship, and also to teach them how to pass those voter registration literacy tests. So she and her colleagues from Mississippi had gone to South Carolina for a 2-week program run by Ella Baker and others in South Carolina. And they were on their way back to Mississippi on June 9th, 1963. And their goal on going on the bus line to and from, it was a 1,400-mile round trip from Mississippi, that they would make sure that each of the interstate bus terminals was integrated. They had no problem eating at lunch counters or using the restaurants in any of the terminals going to and from until they came back and they were in Winona, Mississippi. And they were refused service, and the police came and arrested them. And that arrest, including Hamer being arrested as well, they were sent to the Winona jail, and they experienced 4 days of absolute physical and emotional psychological terror. She was there with several teenage girls. June Johnson, who you can see here on the left, she was 15 years old when she was on this trip. There was another young woman, Yvester Simpson, also very young. She was there on the trip with Inell Ponder here on the right-hand side. She was actually an older teacher in her 30s, and she was going to teach citizenship classes in Mississippi, and she was arrested on that day too. The police were brutal. They beat them badly in the jail, and they could barely stand up. They also sexually assaulted Hamer as well. And that night, as they were suffering, that Sunday night after they were all beaten, Hamer asked them to sing, her friends with her, her colleagues, to sing the spiritual "Walk with Me, Lord, walk with me, Jesus." She needed that to give her the strength to survive that night after that brutal beating, and it did. And that gave me the title for my book, Walk with Me. 4 days later, they were released from jail. Hours after Medgar Evers, the civil rights activist in Mississippi, had been assassinated. The FBI tried to interrogate Hamer, but she refused to talk to them in Mississippi. She didn't trust them, and with good reason, because the FBI agents were generally from the local Mississippi community, and they had sympathy with the whites, not with the Black civil rights activists. So she and Inell Ponder immediately went to Atlanta, where they did give testimony, and they gave details about what happened to them. Hamer's FBI file is quite thick, so are the FBI files for the other civil rights workers. Much of hers is redacted, but strangely, the pages that are redacted in her file are open in the other civil rights workers' files. So I'm not sure what that's all about, but regardless, the detail is frightening about what happened to them in that jail. The Justice Department did charge those police officers, and they were brought up on trial in December of 1963. It was a mockery of justice. It was a disgusting trial, and the way they were treated, these civil rights activists, and the way they gave deference to the police officers that assaulted them. And the jury was out just a few minutes, and they came back with the verdict of not guilty. Hamer did say, however, that she was committed, more committed. It was another rebirth for her after she survived that beating. And by the way, she suffered with physical health ailments that she suffered from for the rest of her life, and contributed to her death in 1977 at the age of 59. But the violence was just part of what was happening in the movement. In September of 1963, you have the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, where the 4 young girls were murdered. And then that happened right after the March on Washington with Martin Luther King in August of 1963. So the movement is picking up speed, but the response from white supremacists is dramatic, and it is horrifying the nation. And the nation is coming to terms with, you know, things have got to change in this country. We can't let this continue to happen. That winter, Hamer and her Mississippi colleagues decided to establish the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in response to their inability to vote in any elections in Mississippi. They were not allowed to be part of the Mississippi regular Democratic Party. So they formed their own party. They had mock elections, and they elected precinct captains and eventually delegates that they could send to the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City that August, where President Johnson would be nominated as the Democratic nominee for the presidential election that fall. And the SNCC workers brought in, it's called the Freedom Summer. And they, let me just pull back here. Here we have this picture. Freedom Summer, 850 young people from around the country plus older volunteers arrived in Mississippi, and they opened dozens of freedom schools for children K through 12. They had literacy classes for adults. They had opened community centers. They had food distribution, and they tried to convince people to try to register to vote so that they could prove to the federal government that African Americans in Mississippi wanted to vote. They were just being prevented from voting. So these are just some of the images of young people that were coming around and going house to house trying to convince people to try to register to vote. And so they held these mock elections where people could learn the process of voting, even though those votes didn't count, but they could take that to Washington, they could take it to Atlantic City and say, here's evidence that people want to vote and they're being prevented. So this is just an example of one of their mock elections with a freedom ballot box. And they got 80,000 votes that they took with them to Atlantic City. So in August 22nd, 1963, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party arrived at the convention. They demanded that they be heard. They wanted the Democratic Party to refuse to seat the all-white Mississippi delegation, and they wanted to be seated instead of that all-white delegation. And so the Democratic Party had a credentials committee hearing, and they had testimony from Martin Luther King and other Mississippi activists, including Fannie Lou Hamer. And it was broadcast live. NBC News filmed the whole thing. And when Hamer spoke, she stunned the audience. People were crying. She testified about what happened to her, what life was like in Mississippi, how people couldn't vote, the violence that was perpetrated against her, how she was threatened every day. People would call and threaten her. People were firing bullets into her neighborhood. And so it was an incredibly powerful speech. And Lyndon Johnson, the president, was at the White House, and he was watching this testimony, and he was worried that her testimony would make the Southern delegates, particularly from Mississippi and Alabama, flee the party and go vote for Barry Goldwater, who was the racist Republican nominee. So he called a press conference, and immediately the camera switched to the president in the press room, and he said something to the effect of, "I just want to remind everybody that today, 9 months ago, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated and the governor of Texas was wounded. And I just want you to remember this and how important, the memory is." And it was like a 3-minute little thing, and then he left the podium. So the NBC News goes back to the hearing room, but Hamer was wrapping up her speech and she walked out of the room. But what President Johnson didn't know is that NBC had cameras there in the room, and they continued to tape her, and they rebroadcast it that night on national television. And her testimony rocked the country. It was her voice, a Mississippi sharecropper with a 6th grade education, that stood up and told the world that she was being denied the right to vote. She was being denied the right to be a citizen. She said to them, and I'm quoting this, "And if this is if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings in America?" And that really hit home for a lot of Americans. She spoke their language. There were many disadvantaged people in the country, and they heard her words. And so she caused problems for Johnson. Ultimately, he negotiated a deal with the civil rights elite leaders like Martin Luther King and Roy Wilkins and Ralph Abernathy and others to give the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party 2 seats, non-voting seats, and allow the all-white delegation to seat on the convention floor and vote for him for the nomination, and Hubert Humphrey. But Hamer fought and fought and fought, but she forced the Democratic Party to also promise that in 1968, they would have diverse delegations from every state. and that Johnson also promised the civil rights leaders that he wanted to pass important civil rights legislation, which he did do in 1965. This is just a picture of Bob Moses with Hamer on the convention floor. Sympathetic people in the party gave them passes to get on the floor, and it enraged the white Mississippi delegates so much they packed their bags and they left. They would not vote. And individually, they all voted in the fall election for Barry Goldwater. And it is a moment in time where you see the Democratic Party in the South, which was dominated by white supremacists, abandon the Democratic Party. They had been holding it hostage, and they abandoned it and they joined the Republican Party. That fall, Hamer decided to run for Congress against Jamie Whitten, who was a longtime white congressman from Mississippi. And her two friends, Victoria Gray and Annie Devine, also ran for public office. And of course, they did not win, but they wanted to make a point. And so they went to Congress after the election and they demanded that the Mississippi delegation not be seated in the Senate or in the House of Representatives. And there were enough votes that it wasn't immediately voted in their favor, but there was enough votes that it went to a committee that would determine whether they would be seated, the white delegation would be seated. Eventually, they lost that effort, that demand. And but what was exciting about it for Fannie Lou Hamer and Victoria Gray and Annie Devine is that the House Speaker, John McCormick of Massachusetts, invited them onto the House floor when a vote was taken on their demand. And they were the first African-American women ever to be seated on the House of Representatives floor, and also the first African-Americans from Mississippi since 1882. So they made history that day, even though they did not get what they wanted out of the whole effort. She marched with Martin Luther King and the March for Fear. James Meredith was a young man who tried to integrate the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, and it was met with great violence. And there was this march in 1966 through Mississippi called the March for Fear, and Hamer led the march, sometimes with Martin Luther King, sometimes with others. She sang, she motivated them. And along the, couple hundred miles of this march, white supremacists drove by in their cars and harassed them and waved their Confederate flags and tried to get them off the road, but it did not work. They continued to fight and raise awareness of what was going on in Mississippi. In 1968, as I said, the Democratic Party had changed its rules. The all-white Mississippi delegation arrived at the convention in Chicago, and the Democratic Party refused to seat them. And Hamer's party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party loyalists, they called themselves, was seated in their place. So it was a victory. And it was an important moment in the Democratic Party. And Hamer went on to become a delegate to the Democratic Party for the next 4 years. And she would also fight for gender equity in the party as well. She started focusing a lot on the local community. She wanted job training programs. She wanted preschool education. She wanted support for Head Start. She wanted food relief programs and poor relief. She wanted access to health care. So she fought for these issues as part of the Democratic Party platform. She also was against the Vietnam War. She campaigned, she went out there and demanded that we get out of the war. She couldn't understand why we were going across the world fighting against people who were subjugating their people when subjugation and discrimination was happening right here in our country. And so she was very much against the Vietnam War. And this is a picture of her in front of the White House in Lafayette Square at an anti-war rally, and she's singing and giving speeches. In the early 1970s, she became very involved in trying to find ways to help local poor families support themselves. And she got help from the National Council of Negro Women, and here is Dorothy Height with Hamer and another woman. They raised money to start a pig farm so families could be given pigs and at the beginning of the season, and piglets. And so they would return 2 piglets at the end of the season and could keep the other pigs that they have and slaughter them to help them get through the winter. And they had a farm, a freedom farm, where they could grow crops and feed their families during the wintertime. Sadly, the mismanagement of the farm and the reality is a lot of people who farmed for jobs also didn't want to farm for their food too, and it just got to be very difficult to manage. But initially it was very effective and it was a good idea. But she was very active in trying to uplift her local community and bringing federal housing in so that people would have better living arrangements. She helped establish the women's political caucus with Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and Bella Abzug and many others, and Shirley Chisholm, who you can see here now, fighting for ERA. And she, as Hamer aged, she became more conservative, but she was a feminist as well. So she had conflict with some of the younger women coming up through the ranks who were strident feminists, and Hamer was a little bit more old-fashioned, but she stuck with it because she did want gender equity. Her health was failing her rapidly. She had been sick since the beating in 1963, and then she developed diabetes and hypertension. And as she aged through the late 60s and into the early 70s, she became very, very ill. And she ended up with breast cancer and dying in 1977. And by that time, she was quite poor. Her medical bills had become quite expensive. The civil rights movement had moved on without her. Her support system was gone, and it was a very lonely and sad death that she had. But her funeral was attended by thousands who came from around the country to Little Ruleville, Mississippi. And one of the people, the volunteers from the Freedom Summer, spoke afterwards and talked about Hamer. And this is what he said. His name was Tracy Sugarman. And he said, all my memories of Fannie Lou Hamer are ones filled with frenetic movement and gigantic energy. She had a kinetic quality that emanated from her like waves setting in motion all who were in her path. And I think that captures Fannie Lou Hamer. And so she had spoken to Americans to walk with her. She helped move the civil rights cause forward, and her legacy lives on today. And as we fight for voting rights again, we should remember her legacy and take lessons from her advocacy. And also in our communities today, there are Fannie Lou Hamers, and they need our support, and we need to elevate them so that the fight for equality and justice and self-determination can continue in this country. So thank you, and I'll stop sharing this. And if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer some questions.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was wonderful. Yeah, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to unmute. I definitely have a few. So I'll go first.
Okay.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your research process, and there, I think in the book description talked about new sources.
Right. So there have been other biographies of Hamer that were written, a long time ago, and but since then there's been so much that has been unearthed and opened up, and including her FBI file and other. Mississippi had its own form of FBI that spied on people. It was called the Sovereignty Commission, and they kept records on all these civil rights activists. So of course, all of the records they have on Fannie Lou Hamer and all of the activities that were going on in Mississippi. And then the organizational records of SNCC and the SCLC, and so much is available from radical organizations that she spoke on their platforms. There's so much out there, and also private papers that have now been deposited in historical societies and libraries and archives around the country. And I was able to interview activists and family members that hadn't been interviewed before. So there's a rich record out there, and shout out to librarians who find all this stuff and digitize it and put it online too for all of us to see, because we need to preserve these records. And I also have to give credit to civil rights veterans who are depositing their own personal papers and organizational papers with archives, the Library of Congress, libraries, and historical societies around the country. And those societies are recognizing the value of those voices, some of them who are still alive, and making them available to the public. So I encourage all of you, if you have an interest in this, go out and look at this stuff. It is amazing. And you're going to see the same language that was used against the civil rights workers and the movement being reemployed again today. It's stunning. It's really stunning.
Wow. Did you travel to the archives, or was it mostly online? Or
so some of it I traveled to, and then with the pandemic, I really had to focus online.
yeah.
So it was great. But Zoom also made it easier to interview people who lived all over the country, and it was preferable for them that, I didn't have to travel to them, or they didn't have to meet me somewhere. They could be interviewed from the comfort of their home. So that really was a wonderful part of it. Yeah.
I didn't know that she had adopted 2 girls. Were you able to speak with them or their descendants?
So I'm glad you asked that. So their daughter, Dorothy, who they adopted in 1944 and was an adult in the 1960s, suffered from anemia, and it was a deadly form of anemia. And she had 2 little children, and she died of complications from the anemia and a tumor. And she had a cerebral hemorrhage, and she died in 1967, which was devastating to Hamer. She and her husband, Pap, raised their daughters, 2 children, their 2 granddaughters. And I did interview one of them. Jackie Hamer Flakes is still alive. The other daughter, Virgie, died just a couple of years ago, and the other granddaughter died as well. So Jackie is still alive.
I'm wondering about, you referenced, go to YouTube and watch her sing, and her video, her her Democratic Convention speech. I'm wondering how having your subject available in recordings changes the process versus like Tubman or
so it was a big difference, because I could hear the cadence of her voice. I could hear that preacher style, and I could hear her diction and her voice when she sang. I mean, and you hear the crowds. There are long recordings at the Smithsonian about some of the rallies she was involved in, and the men get up there and they're like, blah, 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 blah. And then you can hear the crowd is restless, people talking, and then Hamer would come on stage and they would hush. And then she would get them going, and she would speak, and they would do the call and response back and forth. And then she would sing, and they'd get up and start clapping and stomping. And it's unbelievable. And she also was invited to sing at the Newport Folk Festival every summer. And so the recordings of that, you can see those on YouTube, some of them. And she's up there with Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Bob Dylan, and Pete Seeger, and Mahalia Jackson, and Odetta, and it's just like, Joan Baez, and it's like, wow, it's unbelievable. Yeah. It's just really great. And when you see her sing, she throws her head back. And one of her relatives was telling me, he's a musician and singer himself, and he was telling me the process that she used to belt out those big sounds that comes from her diaphragm. But in order to do it, she literally had to take her arm and throw her body back so that voice would just project out into the crowd. So you have to see her singing online and giving her speeches. It really, you will have an appreciation for her. And she was very sharp, and the things that she would say were just cut right to the chase. She was amazing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Here's a question from Laurel. Thank you for this amazing presentation. I'm curious about why it took until 1973 to rule the Mississippi appendectomy illegal.
Yeah, I'd like to know that too. So I know that the ACLU tried to do something about this for years. It took them a very long time. In Ruleville, Mississippi, Hamer told people about what happened to her, and she told them the name of the doctor. And it was in these SNCC files that I discovered the name of the doctor, because they were trying to build a case against him. And they were trying to get testimony from the other Black women in the community that had been sterilized against their will or without their permission. But they were afraid. They were afraid to step forward. So that, I would imagine, happened in other states too. And people just didn't have the wherewithal or ability to stand up. But there was finally, I think it was in Alabama, that a couple who moved into federal housing, their 14-year-old daughters were sterilized, and the parents were told that they were just being given birth control, but they were sterilized. So they filed suit and won and made that illegal. It couldn't happen anymore.
Wow.
I mean, they could do things to women back in the day anyway. You could institutionalize them for anything. So, and that began to change in the 1970s with laws about you need people's permission to do things like that. So,
wow.
Yeah.
I have a couple more. You, at one point, you were talking about how she sort of turned to social advocacy for Head Start and childcare and that kind of thing. And I was thinking of, and that, well, anyway, my question is, did she have any interaction with the Panthers? And I know they're in Alabama, and some of the similar tactics.
Right. So actually, members of SNCC joined the Panthers. By the mid-1960s, all these young SNCC workers are getting beat up and shot at and murdered. And and the Black Panthers are like, we're not putting up this, you know, we're going to fight fire with fire. So some of those SNCC workers that worked with Hamer started rejecting her and that nonviolent stance. Although she wasn't totally nonviolent. She wasn't totally like Martin Luther King. She believed that if you're going to get shot at, then you should be able to shoot back. But she didn't want people to go out and be violent. And the Panthers were bordering on that and were willing to really step it up. And so some of those young SNCC workers became much more radical, and they rejected civil rights workers like Hamer. They were older, they viewed them as more old-fashioned. So she kind of broke away from them, and they broke away from her. And, you know, she, like Malcolm X, you know, he was totally into being segregated. He wanted segregated everything, and she didn't believe in that. She wanted a desegregated, integrated world. But she respected their opinions, and so she just, so that the movement was splitting by the mid-1960s, and she was part of the casualties of the movement splitting apart. A lot of young women ended up leaving the movement and going on and doing other things because they couldn't get leadership positions in the movement, and you know, the violence was getting, you know, atrocious, and it was difficult for many of them to stay and stick with it.
Yeah. Wow. I guess I have two more questions, and
okay.
If anyone else wants to jump in, feel free. My first is, you spend so much time with each of your subjects, I imagine. How long does it take you from deciding you're going to write about this woman until the book, and sort of how does that affect your demeanor?
Yeah.
I mean, you're taking on such, well, some of them are very heroic and some of them are very complex. And how does that go for you?
So it's all hard history, and it does affect me, you know, doing Harriet Tubman and researching and reading and writing about slavery and what happened to enslaved people. That's tough history, and but it's necessary history. And same with, you know, like Rosemary Kennedy. That's a tough story to tell, very tough story. And when I started writing, I started researching and writing Rosemary Kennedy in 2008. And about 2 years into that project, my son, 19 years old at the time, lovely young man, was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And it was scary, very scary. And so that delayed my work on that book. It didn't come out till 2015, but that crisis in my life actually informed the way I ended up writing about Rosemary and her family, particularly Rose and Joe. Even though they were you know, they're complicated parents. I had more sympathy for them having a child with severe mental illness and still in this day and age having a difficulty accessing resources and getting him help. I can't imagine what it was like for them back in the 1910s and 20s, I mean 1920s and 30s and 40s, just, you know, so difficult.
Yeah.
And this book was really hard to write. The violence perpetrated by white supremacists in the South against African Americans is horrifying. And it was there were no repercussions to those white supremacists. And the Black community bore that burden for so long. And writing the chapter about the beating in Winona was very difficult to write. And thank goodness for my colleagues at Brandeis and other places that read that chapter and helped me work through it, because I needed to tell the truth. It's a very graphic chapter, but I needed to give Hamer her voice. With Me Too, that influenced me. I wasn't going to just say, oh, she was just, you know, beaten. It was time for her voice to be heard. And so I used her voice and the voice of others to tell that story.
Oh, thank you. And my last question is, what's next? Do you have anything else in the works?
Yeah, I have a couple of ideas, but I haven't decided definitively yet. I'm going to have to sit with some of the ideas for a while and let them, you know, spark it for me. And there's so many women out there to write about, and I just have to make sure it's the right one for me. Because writing a book takes, you know, 5 years research and writing. And so I need to be able to stick with it and really care about that person. My Mary Surratt book, I did not like Mary Surratt. I discovered that like 3 months into the book, and it was too late. I had a contract.
Oh, wow.
And I despised her. So that was a hard book to write because I didn't like her.
Wow.
But the rest, you know, they're hard to write because of the stories, but I love those women.
Yeah. Well, it shows in your work and in your presentation this evening. And I want to say thank you so much for sharing
Thank
Fannie
you.
Lou Hamer with us tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming, everybody.